What is the relationship between Judaism and Christianity?
If all the non-Christian religions, Judaism holds a unique place in the history of salvation. The Old Testament records the history of the Jews, and it shows how God chose them in a special way and revealed himself to them. God entered into a covenant with Abraham and, through Moses, with the people of Israel. He taught them to acknowledge him as the one living and true God. When Jesus Christ came among humanity, he came as a Jew. Those Jesus chose as apostles were Jews. Most of the early disciples were Jews. Thus the beginnings of the Christian faith were already found among the Jewish patriarchs, Moses, and the prophets. There is a spiritual bond, then, that links Christians with Jews.
Are there any important links between the Quran and the Bible?
Since the Islamic interpretation of history overlaps in significant ways with those of Judaism and Christianity, one should not be surprised to find that some material in the Quran parallels some biblical material. Some narrative treatments of various biblical patriarchs and kings, whom the Quran identifies as prophets and messengers, immediately recall aspects of biblical accounts. But there are also interesting variations in the stories. Adam and Eve's fall, for example, is connected with eating from a forbidden tree, or an ear of wheat in one version. Sprinkled throughout the scripture are references to Abraham's near sacrifice of his son, whom Islamic tradition takes to be Ishmael rather than Isaac, and to Moses' mission to Pharaoh, David's musical gifts, Solomon's royal grandeur, and others. Perhaps the single most important parallel is the story of Joseph. Surah 12 of the Quran retells the tale found in Genesis 39-50 with its own distinctive flavor and variations in detail. Only Joseph's story is told in its entirety, and all in a single surah dedicated entirely to it. Though many Jewish and Christian readers often conclude that Muhammad borrowed from the Bible, that is not necessarily the case. The way the Quran tells the stories, mostly in short excerpts and allusions, suggests that Muhammad's listeners must have been already familiar with at least the general drift of the narratives. There are also some accounts of non-biblical prophetic figures, called Hud, Saleh, and Shu'ab, in some ways unique to the Arabian Peninsula. It is important to note that Muslim tradition has discerned in both the Old and New Testaments references to the coming of Islam's prophet. God promised to raise up for Israel a prophet like Moses, Deuteronomy 18:18, Muhammad. The prophet Isaiah sees two riders approaching, one on a donkey and the other on a camel, Jesus and Muhammad. Jesus promised to send a Parakletos, advocate, John 14:16. But Muslim commentators argue that with the correct vowels, the Greek word is parakletos. Meaning highly praised, the exact meaning of Muhammad in Arabic.
What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise?
Attitudes toward marriage between members of two religious traditions vary considerably. In some traditions, interfaith unions raise relatively little concern, but many others typically either forbid them altogether or take serious official exception and place explicit restrictions on such marriages. Many Muslims and Catholics, for example, continue to hold that interfaith marriages are to be discouraged because of the problems that often arise in the religious education of children. In some communities, it is assumed that the intended spouse from another tradition, most often the wife, will agree either to convert or to see that the children receive solid grounding in the spouse's tradition. In the long run, interfaith marriage holds the potential threat of one tradition's gradual assimilation and loss of identity in favor of a dominant tradition.
Have Jews traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Unlike Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, Judaism has never been connected with major missionary movements. There are several important reasons for that. One is that the land God promised and delivered to the people of Israel is so central to the tradition that deliberate attempts to send representatives abroad in search of more members simply don't fit the picture of a people so identified with geography. Another is that while many Jewish communities gladly receive converts from other traditions, most Jews believe there is more to Jewishness than the profession of a set of religious beliefs.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Confucian?
Confucian tradition consists far more of actions and the preservation of proper relationships than on the expression of specific doctrines. The tradition so pervades Chinese and other Asian cultures that it is like the air one breathes, rather than a distinct set of beliefs. As a result, it is virtually impossible to tell who among Chinese, Japanese, or Koreans think of themselves as Confucians. There are still some people who identify themselves as disciples of the Master, but they are relatively few in number. Since so many rituals that Chinese and other East Asians perform are common to members of various religious traditions, the fact that an individual practiced ancestor veneration, for example, offers no clues in this regard. There are, however, a number of symbols connected with daily life originally associated with Confucius that still appear in popular arts of Asia. The so-called four treasures of the literary apartment, for example, include an ink stick, ink block, brush, and paper.
What special qualities do religious believers attribute to their scriptures?
Four important attributes of scriptures are literal and direct revelation, eternity, inerrancy, and inspiration. Some communities of faith regard their sacred texts as the literal, direct, unmediated divine word, though that word has been delivered through a particular human being. Tradition maintains that the messenger had no part in actually shaping the message. Naturally, every scripture is communicated in some recognizable human language, a tongue in which the divine speaker chooses to be heard. Scriptures also unfold in time, sometimes evolving over relatively extended periods of history. Even so, some traditions teach that this sacred word is eternal, existing always in the divine mind and entering into the physical world of sound, and eventually writing, only at the moment the revealer deems proper. Another common teaching is that divine communication must surely be perfect in every detail since it comes from a perfect source. Insistence on this quality of inerrancy raises all sorts of practical problems for interpreters, who sometimes find themselves scrambling to explain away blatant inconsistencies in factual data such as chronology or geography. Some communities of faith acknowledge that individual persons functioned from the very outset as human authors of sacred texts. Here the quality of inspiration explains that the divine speaker remains the actual author who entrusts the communication to a human writer.
Do Jews have a system of religious law?
Jewish religious law is among the most highly developed and extensive systems ever devised. This is not surprising in a tradition whose scripture begins with a large section, the Torah, for which law is the chief synonym. Ever since the end of the monarchy, Jewish communities have struggled with the problem of how to observe their own religious ordinances within the context of a larger secular or civil regime. In some circumstances, the civil authorities allowed Jews considerable autonomy in administering their religious law, with the understanding that none of its provisions would run afoul of secular statutes. Legal scholars in late antiquity and through the Middle Ages produced voluminous collections referred to generically as the codes of law. Ancient concern with ritual purity and precision persists in some branches of Judaism, especially among the Orthodox and many conservatives. Rabbis function as legal scholars in those situations, interpreting the 613 specific commands and prohibitions of the Torah. For Jews less attentive to the minute details of practice, the rabbi's role is more broadly pastoral.
What is the difference between a guru, an acharya, and a pandit?
A guru is a religious teacher who represents a particular lineage or spiritual tradition and is authorized to initiate qualified students into the tradition. Guru comes from a root that means heavy, grave, and suggests massive spiritual substance worthy of respect. Gurus have historically been distinguished according to certain specific tasks or offices. Those who perform the various rites of passage, and are particularly important in the rite of initiating young upper caste boys into Vedic tradition, are called teaching, shiksha, gurus. A teacher who represents a particular sect and initiates members into it is called an initiatory, diksha, or mantra guru. This guru passes along to the disciple, kila or shishya, a sacred syllable or phrase intended only for that individual. Gurus may be either male or female, and disciples often consider them direct descendants of the deity, with a claim to virtually absolute authority over their students. Many famous Hindu teachers throughout history have earned the title Acharya, often tacked onto a proper name as a suffix, as in Shankaracharya. The term identifies an individual who instructs others in right conduct. Many of those who have received the title have been famous philosophers and theologians. Finally, anyone who watches news coverage around election time will invariably hear commentators referred to as political pundits. In the history of Hinduism, a pundit is a person learned especially in a broad spectrum of oral tradition and practical lore. The scope of the pundit's learning was less specialized than that of the guru, who focused on a higher wisdom aimed at liberation of the soul. Nowadays pundits are generally from families of Brahmins dedicated to transmitting knowledge of the sources from memory, much the way the ancient rabbis preserved Judaism's oral Torah. In short, these three roles complement each other. Pundits have maintained the tradition as accurately as human memory allows. Acharyas further develop the tradition, reflecting on its deeper implications. And gurus help seekers to apply the tradition's wisdom to their personal spiritual lives.
What are the basic features of the more elaborate shrine rituals?
Larger rituals typically include 4 features. Before beginning any sacred act, including the simplest ones, celebrants purify themselves with water or salt. Welcoming the kami, kami mukai, is among the first acts of the presiding priest. The invocation is necessary because many matsuri begin away from the shrine in places where the kami does not ordinarily reside. Next is the offering to the kami, and that includes ancestors, as in Chinese traditions. In addition to responding to the obvious requirement of funds to maintain the thousands of shrines great and small all over the country, people make symbolic offerings and the priests in turn formally present them to the deities. Flowers, food and drink, beautiful textiles or jewelry, and even the performance of traditional art forms or sport can be included among offerings. Entertainment arranged in connection with the religious festival is known as divine amusement, Gonnijiwai. When the priestly staff perform elaborate offerings, the chief priest opens the doors of the innermost sanctuary. The priests pass the offerings among themselves, and finally the assistant chief priest places the offerings before the sanctuary doors. Ritual specialists then recite prayers, many of ancient origin and some more recently composed of praise. Thanksgiving, historical recollection about the meaning of the particular occasion. All concluded with appropriately humble leave-taking of the kami with a gesture called sending the kami away, kami okuri. Ceremonies conclude with a kind of communion rite in which the chief priest serves the other members of the ritual staff a symbolic sip of sake. The priests walk in procession from the inner worship hall to the outer hall for this rite, which is usually brief, depending on the number of officiants participating. When large crowds are in attendance for a particularly festive occasion, the closing meal can be quite elaborate, and include a share in some of the food just offered to the kami. One ritual element notably lacking in Shinto worship is preaching. Since worship is entirely focused on relating ritually to the deities, Shinto tradition does not regard persuasive religious rhetoric a necessary tool.
What would a visitor see if he went to a deist or CCT temple?
Larger traditional Chinese temples, of whatever affiliation, are generally laid out according to the ground plan of ancient imperial residences. Like the palace, the temple enclosure and its main interior structures generally face south. Approaching the temple, the visitor first sees a monumental gateway that offers entry through the temple's surrounding outer wall. Gracefully curved roofs decorated with numerous small multicolored glass or ceramic figures crown the gate as well as the main interior buildings. In some of the more elaborate temples, the main gateway opens into a covered forecourt or a vestibule in which the worshipper can begin to experience the change of mind and calming of the spirit necessary for efficacious devotion. Around the perimeter of the main courtyard one might find small separate halls that function like chapels for devotion to subordinate sacred figures, as well as special features like bell towers. But the focal point of the temple, whether deist or CCT, is typically a freestanding structure in the middle or toward the rear of the main courtyard. A large cauldron or kettle filled with sand, into which devotees insert their offerings of incense sticks, stands 10 or 15 feet away from the main entry to the shrine. At either end of the main building's roofline, and often on the rooflines of other structures in the temple as well, the visitor probably will encounter a curious hybrid aquatic creature, dragon-headed and fish-tailed, called the Jiwen. Popular lore says the exuberant creature protects the building from destruction by fire. Pillars or columns decorated with deeply carved stone dragons, spiraling from bottom to top, often flank the entry to the main shrine. Smaller pillars, similarly decorated, sometimes protrude from the two ends of the roof peaks, columns that support the firmament. Chinese temples typically created a covered space in a portico, surrounding the main courtyard and an open space in the courtyard itself. The main shrine may be a fairly large structure, but ordinary worshippers usually make their offerings standing in front of the building, while temple staff perform associated ritual actions closer to the altars within the shrine. Smaller neighborhood or family temples naturally lack the grand architectural layout. Many are tucked away unobtrusively over small business storefronts, or separate single-room structures with folding doors that open the entire width across the front.
Have there been any sub-communities or denominations within Confucianism?
An early historian of Confucian tradition, Lu Xiang, 77–6 BCE, claimed that by his time the Confucians had divided into 103 schools of thought, each defined by its distinctive manner of interpreting the essential texts. Whether that was literally the case or not, it is clear that during the Song and later dynasties, several important schools developed within the larger phenomenon called Neo-Confucianism. The two main branches became known as the School of Principle and the School of Mind, according to their respective theoretical points of departure. The School of Principle, Li Shui, was also called the Chengzu School, combining the first names of the men it claims as its founders, Chen Yi, 1033–1107, and his brother Cheng Hao, 1032–85, and the later Zhu Shi, 1130–1200. The brothers Cheng developed a sophisticated theory in which principle, Li, meant not the classical Confucian rites and canons of social propriety, but an unchanging universal law inherent in all nature. Zhu Shi further refined that concept of principle, defining it as the great ultimate from which all forces in nature emerge. In what one might call a variety of process theology, Zhu Shi argued that the path to ethical development was the investigation of things. The other major branch of Neo-Confucian thinking was known as the School of Mind, Xin Shui. Wang Yangming, 1472–1529, was one of the school's leading lights. Principle, he argued, was not merely a transcendent and inaccessible cosmic force, but was one with the human mind. He taught that one could cultivate good conduct through reverent seriousness, a type of meditative discipline through which one could realize the unity of mind and principle.
Is there a regular, standard Shinto group liturgical worship?
Communal worship is not a regular feature of Shinto liturgical practice. People may arrive at a shrine in large numbers, but they generally do not gather to worship as a large congregation. Individual and small group worship is the norm, whether for brief impromptu visits made outside the shrine or for more elaborate priestly rituals in the worship hall. A distinctive feature of Shinto architecture is the absence of worship spaces large enough to accommodate sizable congregations. By contrast, the bigger Japanese Buddhist temples accommodate sizable groups in a single worship space. Even in larger Shinto shrines, the parts of the worship facility open to the public are in any case not fully enclosed. Being very much at the mercy of cold weather is the price of wanting a sacred space to be as much in tune with nature as possible. This also reflects the underlying sense that people build community through other activities, but perform their most intimate spiritual duties as individuals or families.
Have there been important Christian mystics?
Since late antiquity, many Christian men and women have been known for their profound experiential insight into the divine mystery. Some of these mystics have been theologians, authors of important treatises on various aspects of the Christian faith. But more importantly, theirs is a legacy of wonder and even bewilderment at the ways God relates to attentive human beings. Some of the best-known Christian women have been mystics. Accounts of Christian mysticism typically begin with the 6th century Dionysius the Pseudo-Areopagite, whose Greek writings laid the foundations of mystical thinking and provided a lexicon that subsequent authors would use for many centuries. Most of the great mystics lived during the High and Late Middle Ages, though a number lived during Renaissance and early modern times as well. Hugh, c. 1096–1141, and Richard d. 1173, of Saint Victor, leaders of the Victorine school of Paris, believed that creation manifested the mind of God and was thus the beginning of a path to contemplation. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098–1179, was a visionary Benedictine nun whose extensive writings and musical compositions have enjoyed remarkable popularity of late, thanks to fine new translations and CD recordings. Mechtild of Magdeburg, c. 1210–80, a member of a lay sisterhood called the Beguines, recorded her revelatory visions of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, as did her younger contemporary Gertrude, 1256–1302. Meister Eckhart, c. 1260–1327. Was a German Dominican whose teaching on divine human intimacy evoked accusations of pantheism and heresy. His spiritual descendants Henry Suso, c. 1295–1366, and Johann Tauler, c. 1300–61, sought to clarify Eckhart by connecting him to the officially acceptable thought of Thomas Aquinas, d. 1274. Other famous mystics, far too numerous to mention individually even briefly, included Catherine of Siena, c. 1340–80, Jan van Ruysbroek, 1293–1381, Juliana of Norwich, c. 1342 to 1413, Ignatius Loyola, 1491 to 1556, Teresa of Avila, 1515 to 82, and John of the Cross, 1542 to 91.
Is pilgrimage an important part of Christian tradition?
By about the 4th century, pilgrimage to Jerusalem had become common enough that significant examples of a type of literature called the pilgrimage narrative have survived. Pilgrims talk of their burning desire to visit sites mentioned in the Old Testament, as well as those associated with key events in the life of Christ. Emperor Constantine's renovation of many of the holy places also made the practice more popular. After the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem and surrounding lands in 638 CE, Christian access diminished somewhat, then improved for a while under the Crusaders' Latin kingdom. But during the Middle Ages, other sacred sites associated with famous saints gradually replaced Jerusalem as the goal of choice for countless European pilgrims. The Shrine of Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain was a major site, said to be built around the remains of Saint James the Apostle. Compostela came to symbolize Christian efforts against the infidel Muslims in the Holy Land. In more recent times, the practice of pilgrimage to Jerusalem and associated holy places has revived with increased ease of travel. Some Christians also flock to lesser shrines associated with saints or apparitions of the Virgin Mary. Pilgrimage was once occasionally prescribed for individuals as penance for sins, but it has never been a central requirement for Christians as it has for Muslims.
Do millennialism or messianism have a place in Shinto thinking?
Mainstream Shinto thought has not developed millennialist or messianic themes of any significance. Some recent sectarian movements, however, have centered around such notions. Events surrounding and in the aftermath of World War II, not surprisingly, raised questions of Japan's historical destiny for many Japanese. So-called new religions of Japan, many with roots deep in Shinto tradition, have been fertile soil for messianic expectations. One such organization is Ananikyo, which teaches open relationships with and among the five Nai religious traditions: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Daoism, and Confucianism. Various relatively recent Shinto-related cults and sects have centered around charismatic leaders whose teachings focus on preparation for an apocalyptic end of this world. For much of the 1990s, for example, members of a group called Aum Shinrikyo attempted to implement the doomsday doctrine of their leader, Shoko Asahara, conspiring to plant biological and chemical agents in Tokyo subways. They planned the final act of human history.
What is a fakir?
Fakir has become a widely used term generally disconnected from its original meaning. It comes from the Arabic word fakir, meaning poor person or beggar in other words. Someone who chooses spiritual and sometimes also material poverty. By extension, fakir has come to refer to a class of individuals, especially in Western and Southern Asia, who engage in shocking and apparently painful physical actions without suffering disastrous consequences. Fakirs capture attention precisely by their ability to come away seemingly unscathed by lying on beds of nails, walking on live coals, eating glass, piercing parts of the body without drawing blood, and similar bizarre actions. In India, the term can also be a reference to perfectly credible and authentic renunciants called sannyasis who show no penchant for outlandish display. But the shift of meaning from Sufi mendicant to wonder-working oddity may have resulted from the claims of some Sufi saints and their followers to miraculous powers.
Are dreams and visions important in Confucianism and CIT?
Popular and official religious practices intersect when it comes to dreams and visions. Confucian tradition as such sees little value in dreams and visions, except insofar as they reveal an individual's state of mind. But Chinese tradition generally puts considerable credence in these alternative and privileged ways of arriving at the truth. For example, emperors are often said to have dreams informing them of the proper course of action with respect to religious matters. Local CIT magistrates who experience difficulty in deciding on legal cases were instructed to stay overnight in the temple of the local spirit magistrate, who would deliver the answer in a dream.
What gender-related issues are important for Christians?
According to the New Testament, women played important roles in the life of the early church, including that of deaconess dedicated especially to ministering to women. Women in the categories of virgins and widows also occupied a special place in church society. The ordained office of deaconess was revived by the Church of England, and slightly later in Methodism, during the 19th century. Nowadays, opportunities for women to exercise leadership varies a great deal among Christian communities. Catholicism is well known for its refusal even to discuss the possibility that women might be ordained to the priesthood. But the Catholic Church is not alone in its stance on gender exclusiveness for positions of official service and authority. Though many churches have never issued formal statements on the matter, the dominant social culture of the groups is such that an exclusively male officialdom is simply presumed. At the other end of the spectrum, Anglican churches in the United States have recently ordained women to the priesthood. Some Pentecostal and holiness churches are entirely comfortable with women ministers and preachers. and in some cases have women as bishops.
What does the term liturgy mean?
The Greek word liturgia, from ergon, work, performed for the letos, people. Originally referred to various forms of public service and eventually came to be associated with priestly service of the gods. Because of the word's use in early Christian sources, it has become part of the religious studies lexicon. Liturgy now generally means any system of rituals mandated for public reenactment by members of a religious tradition. Its public nature separates liturgical action from private or devotional ritual. And since liturgical ritual is by definition required, it is further distinguished from the optional rituals associated with the individual expression of faith. Since liturgy is both communal and required, its performance presupposes some sort of scheduled predictability as well as facilities large enough to accommodate a whole community or segment thereof. Liturgical ritual is central to various Christian communities, Islam generally, and Judaism. Not every tradition's ritual life revolves around liturgy strictly so-called. For some communities a more piecemeal practice of individual or small group worship forms the dominant ritual theme, with larger communal events functioning as annual or occasional variations. Hindus, many Buddhists, and practitioners of Shinto gather for the equivalent of liturgical participation for special festivities, but they typically perform daily or otherwise regular rituals individually or in small groups at various times during the day. One practical result is that their staffs of ritual specialists may perform the same or very similar services many times a day throughout the year.
Are there days devoted to other aspects of Buddhist teaching?
On the full moon day of the third lunar month of Magha, some Buddhists commemorate Buddha's teaching of the monastic disciplinary code called the Vinaya. Thais celebrate by circumambulating the Chaitya and listening to a sermon in the temple. Theravada Buddhists celebrate the Buddha's first sermon on the full moon day of Asita, 8th lunar month, by revering the scriptural text. Some schools celebrate days dedicated to their central scriptures. For example, the denomination named after the Japanese reformer Nichiren 1222-82 honors the Lotus of the Good Law Sutra, as do other groups in China and Japan. Monasteries typically celebrate anniversaries of their founding, and in some countries, a festive day marks the anniversary of Buddhism's arrival with the first missionaries. Members of the Jodo Shinshu, True Pure Land, sect remember their founder Shinran 1173 to 1262, on the 16th of each month, and with a week-long memorial every year in either January or November.
Does anything like millennialism have a place in Islamic thinking?
Yes, so long as one understands millennialism broadly rather than as a precise reference to measures of 1,000 years. Numerous hadith, called traditions of discord, talk of various general features that mark a decidedly downward trend in human life. Honesty will be hard to find. Fewer and fewer people will observe the religious law, and violence will rise. According to other ancient traditions, various explicit signs will herald the end of time itself. A resurgence of chaos symbolized by Gog and Magog will mark a radical turn for the worse. The beginning of the final chapter in the unraveling of history. A figure resembling the prophet, called the Mahdi, guided one, will usher in a temporary age of justice. Numerous individuals throughout the history of Islam have sought to gain political power by claiming to be the Mahdi, most recently in 1979. When armed bandits seized control of the sanctuary of the Kaaba in Mecca. A one-eyed Antichrist figure, called the Dajjal, that's Dajjal, will supplant the Mahdi, luring people away through magic masquerading as miracle. Jesus will eventually return to battle the Antichrist, overthrowing that false prophet and paving the way for the day of judgment. Shiite tradition features its own distinctive type of millenarianism. According to the Shiite interpretation of history, Muhammad's spiritual authority was passed along through a series of descendants called imams. In the view of the 12 verse, by far the majority of Shiites. The 12th and last of these imams, also called the Mahdi, went into greater concealment in 940. This hidden Imam did not die but has remained in a mysterious state from which he will return to establish full justice. In the meantime, the Imam hears prayers and intercedes for believers.
How does the hierarchy among Shinto shrines work?
Over the centuries, Shinto authorities have devised a number of structures and classifications by which to distinguish various levels and functions of shrines. The most important is called the shrine rank system, Sheikakusaido. That has been in place since shortly after the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Jingu designates shrines of top rank under imperial auspices, such as Meiji Jingu, in Tokyo, which enshrines royal ancestors, and Ise Jingu, which is at the top of the hierarchy and is called the Daijingu, Grand Imperial Shrine. Next in rank are the approximately 100,000 jinjia, a generic term including virtually all shrines larger than little wayside structures. About 250 are included on a special list of highest-ranking ones. Of these, some 200 were designated prior to World War II as governmental shrines, Kansha. Many larger jinjia have spawned affiliated or branched shrines called buncha. Multiple shrines dedicated to a single kami generally constitute distinct families, with one shrine usually acknowledged as the original foundation from which branched shrines developed. Some very important jinjia, such as Kasuga in Nara and about a dozen others, have the honorific title Taisha, Grand Shrine, roughly equivalent to Cathedral Basilica. They are also part of a cluster of 22, Niju Nishat, institutions elevated to special status. But even they are divided into 3 levels, 7 high, 7 middle ranking, and 8 lower. That grouping arose out of the practice of ranking shrines within a given region according to their order of priority on pilgrimage routes, or to guide devotees intent on visiting a sequence of holy places. In various prefectures, a further ranking of area shrines simply lists them as first, second, or third shrine, acknowledging the 3 regional shrines that draw the largest crowds of worshippers. A number of Jinjia, some count 138, have been specially designated as nation-protecting shrines. Gokoku Jinjia, because of their dedication to the souls of those who died in battle. 27 shrines within that category, also called deceased spirit invoking shrines. Shokansha, have been accorded a special rank because of the importance of the heroes from all periods of Japanese history that they commemorate. Tokyo's Yasukuni Jinjia ranks at the top of that category. Before 1945, countless smaller local memorials represented the bottom of this hierarchical category. The main central administration is called the Association of Shinto Shrines. Jinjia Honcho, which has branches, called Jinjia-cho, in each Japanese prefecture.
What do traditions not focused on a revelation say about the source of religious truths?
Revealed traditions suggest that the truth is sent down from on high and received by specially chosen persons. That is sometimes called the prophetic model. Other traditions have a rather different understanding of the process. From their perspective, eternal truth suffuses all things, filling the air with its creative sound and virtually bubbling up from the earth itself. Certain individuals specially endowed with unique sensitivities discover, hear, or tune into this pervasive and timeless wisdom. The greater Hindu tradition exemplifies this understanding in various ways, teaching that the divine truth has been passed along since time immemorial by seers and hearers. In China's major indigenous traditions, sages and rulers reflecting deeply on the signs all around them seek an awareness of the all-encompassing mandate of heaven. Japan's Shinto tradition offers another variation on the theme, drawing on the ageless well springs of nature's wisdom for guidance in everyday life. As a general characterization, one could say that whereas the prophetic traditions understand revelation as a somewhat more restricted and privileged access to ultimate truths, the wisdom traditions regard the fundamental truths as more pervasive and available provided one is genuinely open to discovering them.
Does Shinto tradition include pilgrimage?
Pilgrimages of various kinds have long been important to Japanese in connection with both Buddhism and Shinto. Sacred natural objects and shrines are of course the most common goals of Shinto pilgrims. But people do not always make neat distinctions between Buddhist and Shinto sacred sites. What is most significant is that the place has been hallowed by some event or person of great influence in Japanese history, or by natural qualities that betoken beauty and perfection. A distinctive aspect of Japanese pilgrimage is the formation of pilgrimage circuits, junpai, that encompass multiple stops at sacred groves, mountains, caves, waterfalls, shrines or temples, in all imaginable combinations. Most common are circuits of either 33 or 88 sites set up in relatively recent times by railway and other transportation companies. In medieval times there was even talk of 1,000 shrine pilgrimages. Senja-mairi, with multiple visits motivated by desire for greater spiritual merit. Some pilgrims undertake their journeys as acts of asceticism or spiritual discipline, but most seem to regard pilgrimage as an opportunity for reflection and spiritual renewal. A type of pilgrimage to Shinto's most sacred site, the Ise Shrine, has come to be known as the Blessing Visit, Okage-mairi. Another popular pilgrimage circuit leaves by rail from Osaka and takes in sites associated with the 7 gods of good luck, including both Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples. Over 400 traditional pilgrimage routes still attract Japanese Buddhist and Shinto devotees.
Is there a Buddhist pilgrimage?
Just as meditators pursue an inward path to liberation, pilgrims seek the ultimate goal using external symbolism. Sites associated with the principal events in the life of the Buddha very soon became pilgrim goals. Some texts even suggest that the Buddha directed his followers to visit the places of his birth, enlightenment, first sermon, and entry into nirvana. But Buddhists have beaten paths to hallowed places in China and Japan as well. Chinese devotees have mapped out a sacred landscape for pilgrim itineraries centered on 4 sacred mountains. Individual temples have also taken on a special aura, perhaps as a result of an apparition or miracle, or by association with some famous holy person. Pilgrims head for those places both on special occasions and whenever the mood strikes them. Hope for spiritual benefits range from grace to get through a difficult time to healing serious illnesses. Japanese Buddhists also continue to follow a pilgrim road to numerous holy places. One of the most popular circuits is that of the 88 temples on the island of Shikoku. Their pilgrims retrace the steps of the venerable monk Kyukai, founder of the Shinjin denomination. From temple to temple, gathering spiritual souvenirs as they travel.
Who are some of the principal Shinto male deities, apart from those mentioned in the primal myth?
Hachiman, generally identified as the kami of war, is near the top of the pantheon. It is no surprise that he often appears in painting and sculpture as armed and dangerous. But some of the most famous images portray Hachiman as a meditating monk or a solicitous bodhisattva. Almost half of all officially listed Shinto shrines, some 50,000 or more, honor Hachiman. A curious grouping called the Seven Gods of Good Luck, Shishifu-kujin, brings together figures of mixed background. Daikoku, sometimes called Daikoku-ten, hails from India, mythologically speaking, and probably traveled to Japan with an early influential Buddhist founder named Sayako. Daikoku is associated with accomplishment of one's goals and with wealth. Stone statues show a jovial bruiser with a sack over one shoulder, sitting on bales of rice and wielding a mallet with which he grants wishes. Also a god of prosperity, Ebisu is popular especially in fishing villages, rice farms, and local marketplaces. Ebisu is deaf and fails to hear deities being called together for his own October celebration. Like Daikoku, Bishamon, also Bishamontan, is of Indian origin. In the Hindu pantheon he was one of the four heavenly guardians, presiding over the north. In Buddhist as well as Shinto iconography, Bishamon is heavily armed and holds a miniature pagoda in his left hand as a symbol of his authority. Fukuro Kuju, who originated in Daoism, stands for happiness, fortune, and long life, as his name indicates. When depicted in the arts he looks very much like his Chinese counterpart, Xiao Lao, generally accompanied by a crane or deer. Like the next god of good luck, Jurajin, he also has a walking stick to which he has attached a sacred text. Jurajin is another patron of longevity of Daoist origin. Hodei, likewise drawn from the Daoist pantheon, stands for happiness and wealth. Benzaiten, also known as Benton, is the lone female of the bunch. The septet of good fortune kami have been a favorite subject for popular and charming miniature carvings called netsuke. A large number of kami are associated with forces of nature. Fujin, kami of wind, carries a large bag, and his companion kami of thunder. The menacing red-faced Raijin, or Raiden, holds a massive drum. A generic group of minor deities called Dosujin protect travelers ever since Izanagi brought them into being upon his return from the underworld. A kami called Koshin is one protector of travelers, but some also identify him with farming. His three monkey partners have become popular as see no evil, hear no evil, do no evil. Kami keep watch over every conceivable feature of ordinary life. Sujin, a god of water, guards wells and other water sources. For water is the principal means of purification and an essential of life.
Are music and dance important in Hindu religious ritual?
Ordinary daily worship is generally conducted without instrumental or vocal music. Apart from the priests' chanting of Sanskrit prayers of praise and supplication. Special ceremonies, however, can include congregational chanting and singing of hymns. Many temples, especially in India, employ temple musicians to accompany certain rituals, and to walk ahead of portable icons of the deity during processions outside the temple. Playing traditional instruments such as oboe-like woodwinds, drums and other percussion pieces, the musicians fill the air with auspicious sound. During medieval times, troops of dancers, vocalists, and instrumentalists often performed works of classical religious poetry set to music, on the steps of the great temples. Sacred dance reenacting mythic tales of the deities remains an important cultural treasure. But nowadays it takes the form of classical performance outside the context of religious ritual. Among the most popular dances are those that tell of the timeless romance of Krishna and his beloved Radha. Hindu tradition includes a vast repertoire of devotional vocal music in dozens of major languages and regional styles. Singers pray to the various deities, often using classical poetry for their texts. Instrumental performers like the great sitar virtuoso Ravi Shankar have made classical Indian music known far beyond India in recent times. Working with the late violinist Yehudi Menuhin and the Beatles, to name only his most famous collaborators. Shankar popularized a tradition whose roots are deeply religious. Musical modes called ragas, tints, play to the emotions, creating subtle flavors. Rasas, with sounds and rhythms tailored to every season and time of day. God creates the world through sound, and dances creation into existence. Human beings need music and dance to connect with the divine.
Is it true that Muslims never depict human or animal figures?
Browse the pages of virtually any publication designed for Muslim readers and you may be surprised at the number of illustrations featuring human and animal figures. Shelves of mosque bookstores are filled with books, especially those designed for children, similarly illustrated. Still, the notion persists, among Muslims and non-Muslims alike, that Muslims don't do pictures. What most people popularly perceive as a blanket prohibition of images actually applies only to ritual settings. In other words, you will not find figural or representational imagery in a mosque. Islamic and Jewish tradition share the concern that inherent in representational visual imagery, especially of the three-dimensional sort, sculpture, is the risk of idolatry. Muslim artists throughout the ages and across the globe have produced a great deal of figural art, even including images of prophets and other holy persons. But their images are so clearly abstract and non-realistic that they can scarcely be taken as the artist's attempt to usurp God's creative power. For purposes of education and entertainment. Two-dimensional images generally have been perfectly acceptable. In fact, even the prohibition on three-dimensional imagery is far from absolute. Except in the context of worship. For example, Muslim children play with dolls. Devout Muslims express a preference for educationally suitable imagery that exemplifies virtue and ethical values. Under the heading Move Over Barbie, one company markets a doll called Raisin. Dressed in white head and shoulder covering, the hijab, and green full-length gown, jilbab. The hijab is removable so that little girls can learn about donning the proper covering. Raisin's clothes are decoratively trimmed, but she wears no makeup.
Why is Mecca a holy city for Muslims?
Mecca, in western Saudi Arabia, is the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, c. 570, and was his home until the year 622, when those who opposed him forced him to flee to Medina, a city about 200 miles north of Mecca. Muhammad later returned to Mecca and died there in 632. Mecca is also the site of the Great Mosque, which is situated in the heart of the city. The outside of the mosque is an arcade, made up of a series of arches enclosing a courtyard. In that courtyard is the most sacred shrine of Islam, the Kaaba, a small stone building that contains the black stone, which Muslims believe was sent from heaven by Allah, God. When Muslims pray, 5 times a day, according to the 5 pillars of faith, they face the Kaaba. It is also the destination of the Hajj, or pilgrimage.
Is there a central teaching authority for Muslims?
No single individual or institution has universal authority over the global Islamic community. For Sunni Muslims, the nearest approximation to centralized teaching authorities are religiously affiliated educational institutions in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, venerable and influential for very different reasons. Cairo's Al-Azhar, founded in 972 by the Ismaili, Sevener Shiite, Fatimid dynasty, has worn the mantle of religious prestige and authoritative conservatism since it was converted by Saladin and his dynasty. After 1171, for the task of defending the cause of Sunni Islam. In Saudi Arabia, educational institutions of Mecca and Medina have come to share in Al-Azhar's prestige in modern times. Young men seeking careers in religious studies come from all over the world, looking forward to returning home with credentials from these institutions. Nowadays, a senior jurist somewhere might on very rare occasions issue a legal advisory fatwa, claiming universal force, so that every Muslim ought to abide by it. The Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, delivered an order that Salman Rushdie was liable to the death penalty for blasphemy. And Osama bin Laden has called for a jihad against the United States. but rare claims of that sort do not have the binding authority of a centralized institution like the papacy. In various parts of the world, religious scholars join together for consultative purposes. In the United States, for example, a council of imams holds regular gatherings to discuss practical and pastoral problems that arise in local communities. Elsewhere, muftis in a given region sometimes submit their decisions to the further judgment of a grand mufti, who exercises special jurisdiction in religious matters.
Is there such a thing as a non-religious Jew?
Some people who consider themselves Jews are not actively involved in the practice of the religious tradition. It is equally true that some people who call themselves Muslims or Buddhists do not engage in any religious practices. In both cases, one can speak of religious identification as a cultural phenomenon. People grow up in Buddhist or Muslim families and live where the vast majority so identify themselves as if by habit. But in the case of non-religious Jews, the racial or ethnic element is at least as important as the religious, and perhaps more so.
What is the Forbidden City?
A sprawling complex of over half a mile square in the heart of Beijing has been known for centuries as the Forbidden City. Some 1,400 royal rooms, all in single-story buildings, cover 180 acres. Yang Li, 1403–1424 CE, third emperor of the Ming dynasty, 1368–1644. Founded the Forbidden City as his seat of government when he moved his capital from Nanjing to Beijing. From this heart of imperial Beijing radiates a network of sacred sites toward the four directions. Aligned along the city's main north-south axis are the principal residential and ritual structures. The palaces of the inner court to the north and the halls of public ceremony forming the outer court further south. To the east and west are the dozens of subordinate residential and administrative buildings. In a massive plaza before the southernmost ritual space, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, an artificial river runs east to west. 5 small bridges, symbolizing the 5 Confucian virtues, span it. In the various halls along the main axis all the great rituals celebrating the empire took place. In overall symbolism, the Forbidden City reproduced on earth the court from which the heavenly emperor, Shangdi, ruled the universe. Beijing was the last of a series of walled royal capitals. Beginning as far back as 1700 BCE, cities such as Anyang, Chang'an, and Hangzhou all had their sacred centers. Beijing saw the abdication of its last emperor in 1912.
What is the link between Feng Shui and Daoism?
Feng Shui, a term meaning wind and water, is a type of terrestrial divination designed to help practitioners make practical decisions about living arrangements that will be in harmony with natural energies and forces. This symbolic system coordinates critical elements of time and space to allow for maximum harmony in every conceivable human interaction with nature. All natural features, including trees, rivers, mountains, and valleys, for example, have their distinctive influences on the flow of energy. Failure to take of these forces into account can make life much more difficult than it need be. In practical terms, Feng Shui assists people most of all in choosing the orientation and design of the built environment, in other words, architecture and urban planning. A geomantic compass allows people to arrange the spaces in which they live and work in accordance with the principle of the 9 palaces. The compass indicates where yin and yang energies flow. A grid of 9 squares, each of which contains 3 numbers from 1 to 9. Can be used in connection with building plans to indicate optimum placement of particular kinds of spaces within a home or office, e.g. storage, study, eating, or sleeping spaces. This ancient environmentalist system has grown from careful observation of the consequences of human interaction with the greater cosmos. Chinese tradition emphasizes the need to conform with the way of nature rather than attempting to dominate it.